So today we're going to be doing a posterior build-up. I've already got my porcelains out in my trusted colour-coded pots. And we're going to start off by applying some inside powder from the GC kit. This is the inside 44-45 mix for an A35 dentine. I like to use all my porcelains nice and wet, and I'm applying an even coating across the metal coping, which has obviously been opaqued already. Around the margin I've used a little bit of the in powder with some stains to increase the chroma, and then go on and add the dentine, trying to create a nice even accurate build-up. You can see that the porcelain's nice and wet at most times. Helps the porcelain to move into a fairly natural curved shape without having to force dry or drying powder. At this stage I'm just going to mark the cusps of the teeth in this quadrant. This is always a good thing to do to help to keep your cusp ridges in line and give us a nice accurate cutback and secondary build-ups. As you can see, I'm not going to be too fussy at the moment with the morphology. Just get my cusp ridges, main cusp ridges into place. Just as a planning stage, I don't want to spend a lot of time fussing with it at the moment. As is often the case, you find that the palatal cusp is above the coping. Here we're going to do the cut back. I like to keep a nice straight cut back down the face. The important thing here is to make sure you're cutting all the way onto the occlusal surface and into the occlusal surface to make sure you're having proper amount of reduction. You see here from the occlusal, and then cutting through the proximal surfaces and onto the palatal, trying to follow the shape of the cusp as much as possible. And then a little bit of extra reduction around the mid portion of the tooth to make sure that I've got plenty of room for my enamels. After any cut back, I always brush over to make everything nice and smooth, so my transition lines between enamels and dentines are very soft. And what I want to try and do is to leave on the occlusal surface a smaller version of the overall size. So I've rebuilt with the enamels now, and this stage I'm going to cut back out. So from the occlusal ridge I'm going to cut back into the centre of the tooth right down to the coping. You see the green lines, and basically the ridges should be fairly in line. The occlusal surface of the 6 is not that much larger than the premolars. So carry on cutting straight down off the occlusal ridge onto the surface of the opaca. A little bit of an accident there. I like to get rid of as much of the porcelain as possible, so I've got a nice sharp edge. And there you can see the occlusal ridge standing out quite nicely. Now with a metal ceramic I start by putting an in powder, in 42, with some cervical stain, an orange stain which has high chroma and higher opacity because of the stain content. This helps to disguise the opaca and gives me a nice start. So now that's the occlusal, the hard bit. I'm going to start here, adding the cusp bridges in, just getting the basic form of the cusp bridges with probably a translucent enamel mix from the black pot. You can use CLF, or you can use the more opacified blue pot enamel if you haven't got that much space. So just a little addition on each of those. Now the wavefront, which is the phosphor orange mix, which is in 42 CT23, using the moisture content of the porcelain application to create a nice soft curve in the middle of the tooth where the main phosphor is going to be. And now on the other side, on the buccal cusps, creating the same type of soft curve with my phosphor orange mix. And now that's done, we're going to move on to applying the rest of the occlusal surface with the bright occlusal, which is EO15, a whitish enamel designed for occlusals, and CT22. And this is applied in very small increments. I work around the tooth, going from the main functional cusp, contact areas, and then mesiobuccal, histobuccal, and then the proximal surface on the distal contact. Trying to add small amounts of porcelain, retaining the shadow in the main fossa region, and trying to pick out the primary and secondary ridges on each of my cusps. With the porcelain nice and wet and using the proper modelling liquids, you can push these cusp ridges around to make a little bit more space, so that on the second build-up we're going to have plenty of room to put some nice detail in and get those nice curves on our occlusal surface, which give the fossa and cusp a realistic look. And that's that pretty much done. So now the crown's fired, and we're just going to apply a little bit of glaze liquid onto the surface to help the second addition go on. It helps it run smoothly across the surface. The smoother you can get the first firing, the better. There you go, you can see a nice gloss on the surface there, ready for application. Trying it back onto the model, and checking the cusp ridges are in line with the green lines we painted onto the model earlier. We're ready to go. So I reapply the enamels to the axial surfaces first up. Now I'm going to add on to the contacts. I like to re-establish the contacts, the correct height and a nice straight contact, mesially and distally, before I start adding to the occlusal surface. The rhomboid shape of the upper six is helped by a good kick on the distal contact there. So now we're going to add, with bright occlusal mix, going to add back on to reform the central fossa and our main ridges. Depending on the amount of space you've got, you can use a very small amount of porcelain, or in this case we've got a reasonable amount of space, so we're adding on quite a good amount, re-establishing the shadow in the fossa, main fossa regions, applying from both sides in the same order as we did in the first build-up to create that nice fossa region, mid-fossa, buccal and palatal. As we go around here, I'm just adding on the buccal fossa, adding a little bit of shape, mostly perpendicular to the main fossa, but you can afford to add a little bit of shape using the nice sharp brush. This is a Renfurt Takanashi brush number 6. Now just adding the finishing touches. Porcelain's nice and plastic, you can move it around and create those little micro details on the ridges, just keeping the shadow, and that's ready for firing. So a little bit of grinding, try and avoid doing too much grinding to the occlusal surface itself, but obviously the axial surfaces, contacts needs to be amended. And then just a little bit of stain. I use a nice non-fluorescent dark stain, which I try and use sparingly, although it's nice for us. It's not much fun for a patient to see too much, so try and keep that down a bit. And then the crown's finished. And that concludes the presentation. I hope that's useful.